Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of StarFox Dark, a D&D game. I am your host, DWL52. This game takes place as an alternate and much darker version of the first StarFox game that my group is currently running. So, the following is a brief history of this version of Corneria. Between 2023 and 2075, the reign of the Corporate Congress. During this tremendous time in Cornerian history, the Corporate Congress reigned supreme over multiple countries. They controlled all forms of trade and commerce. Poverty ran rampant, and through their program of, quote, social freedom, citizens were forced to sign over their basic rights just to feed their families, keep their homes, and even receive minimal medical care. It was a time of capitalism run amok. 2075 and 2076, this is called the Revolution and the Burning Nights. The people of Corneria, finally angry enough at the status quo, took action. Anti-capitalist literature was published via secret printing presses and distributed around the world. The Infonet, or the Cornerian Internet, was largely abandoned in these efforts due to high levels of corporate surveillance. In response to these works of literature, books, and art were outlawed, and people believed to be involved with the anti-capitalism movements were taken from their homes in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. The government waged open war on their own people, so the people fought back. Between 2076 and 2079, this is called the Great Trade Wars. On the 3rd of Sambara, 2076, the Corporate Congress launched its largest raid against private civilians and those they deemed dissident and traitors to the incorporated countries of Corneria, or the ICC. The people, still in shock over the burning nights and outraged by this latest act of cruelty, formally revolted. Open war had begun. It spread across the continents like a wildfire, brother fighting brother. It was the most bloody planetary war in all of Cornerian history. For a time, it was even deemed to be the war to end all wars. Later on, after the Visitors' War, this conflict was renamed to the Great Trade Wars. At the end of 2079, this is called the Armistice and Rebuilding. At the end of 2079, on Dakara 27th, the final bastions of loyalty to the ICC surrendered to the allied peoples of Corneria. A multitude of anti-capitalism laws were put in place to prevent companies and corporations from ever becoming large enough to take over again. The war had ended, and a time of mending and mourning had begun. Between 2080 and 2099, this is called the Reformation. With the rampant devastation wrought to Corneria from heavy fossil fuel use and a number of nuclear strikes from the trade wars, the planet's greenhouse effect was raging out of control. Droughts, wildfires, tropical storms, rising sea levels, and increased tectonic activity created mass starvations and new conflicts. On top of this, with the newly formed People's Republic still weak and disorganized, many former corporations started to once again seize power for themselves and fight back against global reformation. Ecological collapse was imminent, and a new Cold War had begun between those who were seeking profit and wealth versus those who were prioritizing the planet's healing and rehabilitation from decades of abuse and war. Spycraft, espionage, and sabotage were common household concerns. Neither side dared approach open war again, but they wouldn't back down either. 2112 is the start of the Friendship Space Program. Despite the constant back and forth with the corporations and the people's government, some good did come out of this time in history. The government, along with several corporate entities, created the Friendship Space Program. This monumental first step towards becoming a spacefaring people was made possible by the invention of the ion drive technology. This allowed probes and eventually manned missions to neighboring planets. Prior to the war, the planets of Kitina and Fortuna had been mildly explored via satellites and a handful of robot missions. Friendship 1, all the way through Friendship 21, expanded on the collective knowledge of Corneria, but in profound ways by visiting the neighboring 6 worlds. In 2114, this is called the Rape of Lylat. Corneria is not the only life-sustaining planet in the Lylat system. The Friendship Program, along with a multitude of deep space exploration probes, discovered 19 other planets orbiting either Lylat A or B. Many of these worlds were discovered to be capable of supporting life, or at least allowed for slightly easier colonization. Colonization efforts began immediately, setting off a period of time that would become known as the Rape of Lylat. Corporate greed once again manifested itself in the newly organized governments. Measures that were taken to stem the tide of devastating climate change were pushed aside as these entities raced to lay claim to anything they could in the system. Entire worlds like Zonas and Venom fell victim to unchecked and utter devastating overpollution. At the end of 2114, this is called the Pledis Revolution, probably the single most hated, praised, and controversial event in modern history. The Pledis Revolution continues to be a hot-button topic to this day, over 200 years later. The head of the Cornerian Defense Force, a General Ulysses Pledis, a staunch environmental conservative, became fed up with the corporations continuing to ruin any effort of planetary repair. Mass extinctions continued at an alarming rate, and people were constantly dying from extreme weather, starvation, flooding, and wildfires. Despite the public outcry for stronger protective measures, the corporations continued to block any and all measures put forth. They were attempting to form yet another Congress to, quote, protect their rights as legal entities. Violence was escalating and another great war was imminent. Unwilling to see what would happen if indeed another war occurred, General Pledis used the CDF to launch a system-wide coup d'etat. Each and every corporation was overthrown overnight in a massively coordinated ambush of their various corporate headquarters. At the time, corporate loyalist media tried to call it Pledis War, but the term never really held, as fewer than 50 people lost their lives. 2114 through 2176. This is the Pledis Reformations. General Pledis took over the entirety of Lylat governments, both on-world and off. He had become history's most powerful dictator. Pledis often wrote how he hated to be the death of democracy. However, rather than abuse his power, Pledis used it to enforce badly needed environmental and social reform. Employment, wages, resource use, colonization efforts, basic civil rights, everything was heavily scrutinized by Corneria's top minds and ultimately placed under the care of an elected council. Everything from workers, civilians, and corporate rights to distribution of wealth and building rights became organized by a system of interconnecting councils that to this day are known as Pledis councils. Corporations, as they were then known, became completely outlawed. They are now heavily regulated by CEOs or other high-ranking positions, capped in power and wages by world laws. Before Pledis voluntarily left power in 2176, he had moved everything away from capitalism to a more socialist government. He later died in 2178 at the age of 98. A memorial of him can be found in Capital City in front of the government building. However, it has to be kept under constant surveillance as it is often the target of vandalism even to this day. 2177 through 2282, the golden era of space exploration. Despite the great many conflicts, battles, and minor uprisings, the government that Pledis established held strong. The massive devastation that Corneria and the other worlds had suffered at the hands of rampant and unchecked capitalism were slowly repaired over these years. The damage to Zonas and Venom are still a struggle and may never be completely healed. They are still toxic to this day. However, the rest of the system continues to recover at a slow but steady rate. The socialist programs that Pledis instituted continued to do what they intended, despite their perceived flaws and public hatred. Unemployment, homelessness, crime, disease, war, and poverty were all but wiped out. Exploration and scientific advancement became the driving force for societal growth. During this time, the most thorough explorations of many worlds of the Lylat system started. Efforts were made to completely map every world in the Lylat system, as well as set down laws for colonization and exploration, so as to allow each world's unique qualities to be explored, utilized, and preserved for future generations. 2282 through 2287, the Visitors' War. Sadly, despite their amazing accomplishments, the Lylat system was not prepared for their first contact with intergalactic visitors. While some minor defensive measures were developed, the Cornerian Defense Force was almost entirely in mothballs. For over 100 years, nothing more than border skirmishes arose on the colonized planets, and those were typically handled by local law enforcement. There was almost no need for a grand military. However, that changed when the Sadao fleet arrived. Massive black ships invaded the Lylat system, destroying starbases and observation posts as they moved from the outer solar system inward. For 5 long bloody years, the mysterious invaders were unstoppable, conquering Lylat B and the outer worlds effortlessly. For a time, it seemed as though the mysterious invaders would win, wiping out all life in the Lylat system. When the war seemed at its bleakest, the Supreme General Herbert Porcus managed to devise a brilliant counterattack that would turn the tide of the war. Using divisionary tactics, he and his forces managed to convince the invaders that their troops were consolidating on Corneria for one final defensive effort. When the invaders, now identified as the Sadao, moved in for the kill, they fell into a pincer strike. The ensuing battle destroyed 3 Sadao motherships and seemed to badly affect the Sadao's ability to coordinate their forces. Without formal leadership, they went from behaving like a well-organized military to a group of unruly marauders. Oddly enough, even though barely 15% of their forces were destroyed in Porcus' attack, the Sadao withdrew to regions unknown and have not returned since. To this day, no signs of the Sadao have been detected, nor remnants of their fleet found. The Cornerian Defense Force run a series of automated lookouts that orbit well beyond the system's Kuiper Belt to prevent another force from entering Lylat space unannounced again. Publicly, no one really knows what the Sadao looked like or why they chose to invade the system. Their ships, vehicles, and foot soldiers would self-destruct upon death. They were the embodiment of a mystery, and one Corneria is well glad to be rid of. In 2290, the Syrian Refugee Incident. While this is not common knowledge, shortly after the Sadao left Lylat and reconstruction efforts were underway, another group of visitors came to the system. These visitors were found adrift in massive, barely armed sleeper ships. The refugee population so resembled Cornerians that, despite the people's newly found xenophobia, the fledgling government agreed to allow them to stay and live amongst the people in secret. Without any other option, the Syrian elders begrudgingly agreed to the government's terms. To this day, the existence of alien refugees remains a closely guarded secret. Despite all the progress Corneria has made in many ways, there are still portions of the population who would act violently to learn that aliens have been living amongst the general public for some time. In closed tribunal circuits, the Syrian secrecy continues to be a topic of heated debates. And that is it for part 1. Due to this already hitting the 13-minute mark, I don't want to drag this on any longer than I need to. So, I will return at a later date for part 2 on the timeline. I am sorry that this timeline has taken so long and dragged out, but our game master tends to put a lot of detail in, and I'm reading the script straight to you. Have a wonderful day, and remember, gamers don't die, they respawn.